An Irish MEP stood up in the European Parliament and said what many governments are saying more carefully. She said the United States has become a rogue state. That is extreme language. It is also a signal, not because the European Parliament has the power to act on it, because the fact that it was said without significant backlash, without institutional rebuke, without it being treated as extraordinary, tells you something about where the conversation has moved. The question Cleo is mapping is not whether that characterization is accurate. The question is structural. What is the pattern of behavior across 12 countries and 2 international institutions that produce the conditions in which that speech was received as reasonable? This is not an anti-American brief. It is a map of how America is being read. China, Russia, Ukraine, Spain, Italy, the European Union, the United Nations, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Canada, Bolivia. All of them are processing the same event. The US and Israel struck Iran. All of them are drawing their own structural conclusions. On May 14, 2026, Donald Trump arrived in Beijing. He did not come alone. He brought 12 or more of the most powerful corporate executives in the United States: Tim Cook, Apple, Elon Musk, Tesla, and SpaceX, Jensen Huang, NVIDIA, others. Xi Jinping met with the CEO delegation collectively, not individually, not as private guests, as a group, in a controlled audience inside state-to-state diplomacy. Xi told them China would open further to American business. That message was for the executives. It was also for Washington. Come to Beijing, and you get access. Stay away, and the market stays closed. This is not a trade negotiation. This is a demonstration of leverage. America showed up with its billionaires. China showed up as a state. The difference matters. Corporate executives are not foreign policy. They are incentives. And incentives can be managed, rewarded, or withheld by a state that knows what it is doing. Beijing ran this meeting as one instrument in a much larger diplomatic composition. The executives got a collective audience. The heads of state had their own channel. The distinction was deliberate. China did not collapse the two into one conversation. It kept them separate, and in that separation, asserted that it is the state that decides what American business gets access to. America brought its billionaires. China brought the state. On March 2, 2026, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Mao Ning was asked about the Hormuz disruption. She said Beijing called for parties to stop military operations. She called Hormuz a vital international route. She said the strait must remain open. Then she said something that governments usually say only in private. The root cause of the Hormuz disruption, she said, was U.S.-Israel illegal military operations against Iran. That is the Chinese government on record in an official press briefing characterizing U.S. and Israeli military action as illegal and as the cause of a global energy crisis. This is not abstract for Beijing. Chinese state refiners depend heavily on Middle Eastern crude. After the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran, Chinese refiners cut crude processing sharply. They did not choose to. They were forced to, because the supply disruption hit their feedstock. When the Chinese MFA said Hormuz disruption was caused by the U.S.-Israel attack, it was not just diplomatic positioning, it was a statement about what is happening to Chinese industrial output. China runs 20% of global manufacturing. That manufacturing runs on Gulf crude. Gulf crude moves through Hormuz. Hormuz is being disrupted by an American military operation. The supply chain runs directly from American foreign policy to Chinese factory floors. Beijing said the quiet part out loud because the cost is being paid by Chinese state enterprises. And state enterprises, unlike private companies, do not absorb costs silently. They report them to the government, and the government says something about them. What it said was, the root cause is U.S.-Israel military operations. That is a diplomatic indictment, filed in public on record. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Europe sanctioned Russian energy. The logic was sound: cut the revenue, limit the war machine. The result was a massive structural shift in global energy flows. Russia turned east. Power of Siberia, the Russia-China gas pipeline, reached 38.8 billion cubic meters in 2025. That is a record. Russian oil exports to China grew roughly 35% in early 2026. China is now Russia's top oil customer. Russia is now China's top oil supplier. This energy architecture does not need the Atlantic order to function. It does not use European ports. It does not use the U.S. financial system. It does not route through any institution Washington controls. On May 19, 2026, less than a week after Trump left Beijing, Vladimir Putin arrived. Think about the sequencing. Trump brought his CEOs, Putin brought the state visit, Beijing received both. Xi is threading a needle. Maintain stable relations with Washington for economic access, maintain strong relations with Moscow for energy and strategic depth. He is not choosing between the two. He is running them in parallel. And that parallel architecture is only possible because Russia-China energy integration has reached a level where Beijing no longer needs to prioritize the Western system to keep its economy running. Europe sanctioned Russia's energy to punish Russia. The actual consequence was to accelerate an energy union between Russia and China that is now structurally independent of European or American influence. The West made a move, Beijing made a deal, the deal compounds annually. Zelensky thanked Trump for continuing weapon supplies. That sentence contains the whole paradox. Ukraine needs American weapons. It has no alternative supplier at the scale required. The practical dependence is real, and Zelensky knows it. But the United States also told Ukraine that security guarantees would be linked to giving up Donbass. Zelensky called this dangerous. He is correct. Linking a security guarantee to a territorial concession means the guarantee is conditional on Ukraine accepting a position that the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian constitution, and the Ukrainian people reject. That is not a security guarantee. That is managed capitulation. Brookings characterized what is happening plainly. Trump's mediation appears biased toward Russia. Both Kiev and Moscow have little faith in U.S.-brokered peace talks, which puts Ukraine in an extraordinary position. It still needs America. It still accepts American weapons. It still works within the American-led security framework. And it no longer believes the framework is designed to produce a just outcome for Ukraine. This is not ingratitude. This is a rational reading of the incentives. Ukraine looks at how the U.S. handles Iran, striking without UN authorization, without coalition consensus, without a clear post-strike plan, and draws conclusions about how the U.S. handles situations where its interests diverge from its allies. The message from Kyiv is not spoken but legible. We still need America. But we cannot build our survival on American mood swings. On March 4, 2026, Pedro Sanchez stood up and called the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran unjustifiable and dangerous. Then he did something more consequential than criticism. He denied the United States the use of Spanish military bases for Iran-linked missions. Spain hosts significant U.S. and NATO military infrastructure. Rota Naval Station, Morón Air Base. These are not symbolic facilities. They are operational nodes in the American global basing network. Denying access to those facilities is not a speech act. It is a material constraint on American military reach. Trump responded by threatening to cut off trade with Spain. Spain did not back down. This is the template of the new European response. Not isolation, not alliance rupture, but conditionality. Spain did not say we are leaving NATO. Spain did not say we're opposing American interests across the board. Spain said we will not be an operating base for this specific operation in this specific war. And it held that position under direct economic threat from the American president. That is a data point, not about Spanish courage, about American leverage erosion. The threat of trade retaliation used to produce compliance. It did not produce compliance. Spain ran the calculation and decided that moral and legal clarity was worth more than avoiding Trump's trade threats. Spain did not just criticize the war, it denied the machine a runway. Giorgia Meloni positioned herself as the bridge to Trump. She was one of his closest European allies. She ran the political calculation that proximity to Washington was worth more than distance. For a while, the position held. Then the Iran war happened. And suddenly, Meloni was not managing an abstract alliance. She was managing an energy crisis, a budget crisis, and a public that is paying surging energy prices because of a war Italy did not vote for and did not start. Meloni asked the European Union for budget flexibility to deal with energy costs. The EU rebuffed the request. So Italy is now caught between two pressures. The US expects loyalty and deference, the EU expects fiscal discipline, and Italian citizens expect their energy bills to be manageable. Meloni cannot deliver all three simultaneously. The Iran war has made that arithmetic impossible. She cannot explain to an Italian pensioner that the energy bill is high because of American foreign policy decisions, while simultaneously defending those decisions as the correct ones. She cannot ask Brussels for an exemption from deficit rules, while Brussels is watching her maintain alignment with a Washington that the EU is itself diverging from. Italy is the loyal ally discovering that loyalty does not pay the energy bill. And when loyalty stops being free, it starts to become negotiable. On March 19, 2026, the European Council issued formal conclusions on the Middle East. De-escalation, maximum restraint, protection of civilians, respect for international law, moratorium on strikes against energy and water infrastructure, warning of economic instability, supply chain disruption, migration pressure. That is a European institution formally placing itself on the opposite side of the policy choices being made in Washington. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas called on the US and Israel to end the war. She said the EU did not understand some American moves. Multiple European nations refused Trump's calls to join the Hormuz coalition. They said it explicitly, a war that they did not start. The EU is not unified enough to lead. It cannot produce a coherent strategic response because it is 27 governments with 27 different calculations about energy, trade, and defense dependence on Washington. But it is no longer obedient enough to follow blindly. That is the new condition, not European strategic autonomy. That remains aspirational. Not European rupture with Washington. That remains politically impossible. But systematic, institutionalized public disagreement. European Council putting its conclusions in writing. The EU Foreign Policy Chief telling America to stop. Member states refusing specific military coalition requests. These are not symbolic acts. They are a record. And the record is accumulating. On February 28, 2026, the UN Secretary-General issued a statement. He condemned military escalation. He said the use of force by the United States and Israel against Iran undermined international peace and security. He cited the UN Charter. He noted that the Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. He did not say the U.S. and Israel were perhaps mistaken. He did not say we urge all parties to consider moderation. He said the use of force against Iran undermined international peace and security. That is a statement of structural fact under international law, not a condemnation with implications for enforcement. The UN does not enforce against permanent Security Council members, and both the US and Israel benefit from that architecture. But it is still a naming. The United Nations Secretary-General named the United States as an actor whose use of force undermined international peace and security. That is the language of the UN Charter applied to America. Not to Iran, not to Russia, to the United States, the country that was the primary architect of the post-1945 international order and the primary beneficiary of its rules. The rulebook is not being burned by enemies of that order. It is being set aside by its principal author, and the institution created to uphold it is saying so, carefully, on record, without the power to act, but also without the willingness to be silent. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia called for a ceasefire in the Iran war. They said disputes between states should be resolved through international diplomacy, not through unilateral military strikes, not through coalition warfare, through diplomacy. That is the position Mexico's constitution requires. Non-intervention, peaceful settlement, respect for sovereignty. These are not abstract principles for Mexico. They are the doctrinal response to a century of experience with a powerful northern neighbor. At the same time, the U.S.-Mexico relationship was being pushed toward a breaking point. U.S. accusations of cartel corruption in the Mexican government. Reports of alleged covert U.S. operations inside Mexican territory. Mexican sovereignty being treated as negotiable when American security interests are at stake. Mexico is not just responding to Iran, it is defending a principle. The principle is countries have territorial integrity, and powerful countries do not get to treat weaker countries as operating zones. When Mexico says disputes should be resolved through international diplomacy, it is also saying that to its northern neighbor. The Iran statement and the bilateral tension are not separate. They are the same argument about the same principle applied in two different geographies. Mexico has no illusion that it can stop American power. It is not trying to. It is placing its position on record. Building the record matters, especially for a country that has needed those records before. On March 3, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney issued a statement on Iran. He condemned Iranian strikes on civilians. He said civilian life must be protected. He said the rule of law must be respected. And then he said something that no Canadian Prime Minister would have said in an earlier era. He said international law binds all belligerents and implored all parties, including the United States and Israel, to respect the rules of international engagement. Including the United States and Israel. Those 5 words are the data point. Canada is the United States' closest ally. Shared border, shared NORAD, shared intelligence, CUSMA trade agreement, 5 Eyes. Every security architecture the U.S. built in its immediate neighborhood, Canada's inside it. And the Canadian Prime Minister put legal conditions on the alliance, not by leaving the alliance, not by threatening to leave the alliance, by stating in public, on record, that the same law that governs Iran's conduct governs American conduct. That is ally language. It is not blank check language. It is conditional alliance language, and the condition being named is compliance with international law. Canada is not breaking with America. It is putting legal quotation marks around the alliance, and those quotation marks are now in the record. Bolivia's new government under Rodrigo Paz restored diplomatic relations with Israel. It moved to improve ties with the United States. That is real. New governments change direction. The Morales era is over. Paz is pragmatic. Bolivia wants investment and diplomatic normalcy. And yet, Bolivia's foreign ministry condemned the U.S. bombing of Iran as an attack on Iranian sovereignty and a grave violation of international law. In 2025 and again in 2026, reaffirming commitment to peace after U.S.-Israel attacks on Iran. These two things are true simultaneously. Bolivia restores ties with Israel. Bolivia condemns the bombing of Iran. This is the global South split screen. New governments in Latin America may shift diplomatically. They may seek better relations with Washington and Tel Aviv. But the anti-intervention instinct does not disappear. It is encoded in the institutional memory of countries that have been on the receiving end of intervention. Bolivia remembers 1964. Bolivia remembers 1971. Bolivia remembers 1980. Bolivia's national memory of external interference is not a political stance. It is constitutional identity. And when America bombs Iran, Bolivia reads it through that memory. Not because Iran is Bolivia's ally, not because Bolivia approves of Iran's government, but because the principle that major powers do not get to bomb smaller countries without accountability is the same principle that has protected Bolivia from that kind of power. These countries remember what empire feels like when it lands on their soil. That memory does not expire because the government changes. China says the root cause of Hormuz disruption is U.S.-Israel military action. The UN says American use of force undermined international peace and security. The EU says stop hitting energy and water infrastructure. Spain says no war from our bases. Italy says the energy bill is becoming politically impossible to defend. Ukraine still needs American weapons but increasingly doubts American mediation. Mexico calls for sovereignty and diplomacy. Canada warns that even allies are bound by law. Bolivia shows how the global South reads intervention through institutional memory. None of these actors is operating in the same alignment. China is not coordinating with Bolivia. Canada is not coordinating with Russia. Ukraine is not coordinating with Mexico. They are responding independently to the same stimulus. And the responses are converging on the same structural observation. The world is not arguing about whether America is powerful. That is not the question. The question being asked in Beijing, in Brussels, in Kyiv, in Ottawa, in Mexico City, in La Paz is different. Is American power still stabilizing, or has it become one of the forces destabilizing the system it claims to defend? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a structural question, and it does not have a reassuring answer. The system was built on the premise that American power, whatever its costs, was net stabilizing. That wars like this one prove the system needs American force to defend it. What we are mapping is the accumulating evidence that an increasing number of governments, allies, partners, neutrals, are no longer certain that premise holds. They are not certain it doesn't. They are certain they are no longer certain. That uncertainty is the story.